Greetings from Pintpot. Welcome to my latest edition of Climbing the Curve, a series intended to make the hunter, rather than the hunted, a little faster. Now today I'm going to be taking a look at basic gun mechanics. Now one thing which is immediately apparent when you start using the guns of Planetside 2 is the recoil. All small arms have vertical recoil. They also have horizontal recoil, some to the right, some to the left, and some in both directions. Being able to compensate for recoil is one of the key skills you need to learn to improve in gunplay. However, recoil is not the only feature which impairs you being able to hit your target. Each gun has its own inherent cone of fire plus bloom mechanic. Now under gun details it tells you the size of a cone of fire for both hip firing and ADS, plus the degree to which it blooms per shot. The first four numbers are cone of fire in various stances, and the fifth one is the bloom. Now what these numbers basically mean is this. If you have a cone of fire of 0, other than via the effects of bullet drop, you're guaranteed to hit what is in your target. However, the larger the number for the cone of fire, the greater potential deviation. And the way this is calculated is degrees of deviation. In addition, each additional shot you take after the first increases the cone of fire by the amount recorded under the bloom. What this means is that when you're holding down the trigger, not only do you have to contend with the recoil to remain accurate, but also an ever expanding cone of fire. So what are the implications of this in practice? As the deviation in the cone of fire is measured in degrees, at close distances it makes very little difference. However, the effect gets increasingly magnified the further you are away from the target. Therefore, at longer distances, it quickly amounts to the difference between being able to hit your target and miss them. Therefore, at long distances, it is imperative to minimise the effect of this ever-expanding cone of fire by keeping your shots to small bursts. Otherwise, the cumulative effect of the bloom will mean your shots become incredibly inaccurate. So the consequence of this is at short distances you can pretty much just hold down the trigger. However, as you get further and further away from the target, you need to burst fire in ever smaller clips. Ultimately, at very long range, you shouldn't be firing any more than 1 or 2 shots in any one burst. And it is with this principle in mind that at closer distances you can keep the trigger down, but at longer distances you're required to burst fire. It gives you an idea of which guns are best suited for which distance. Now in close quarters combat, where the relative inaccuracy of the weapon plus the bloom factor make comparatively little difference, you're looking for 2 things from your gun. The first, and most important, is a very short time to kill. Or in other words, when you're in face-to-face confrontation with your target, you need to be putting them down faster than they can put you down. However, in most instances, a faster rate of fire also goes along with lower bullet damage. Therefore, it doesn't guarantee you a shorter time to kill. However, even taking this into account, if you're given a choice between a high rate of fire, low bullet damage, versus a low rate of fire, high bullet damage, each with an equal time to kill, you want to go with a high rate of fire gun. And there are 2 reasons why. The first is to minimise the time necessary to achieve overkill. Ideally, to kill your enemy, you only want to deal 1000 damage. However, frequently the final bullet to kill will go over this amount by some variable amount. Therefore, a higher rate of fire, lower bullet damage weapon will minimise the time necessary to achieve that final damage to gain the kill. But with a low rate of fire weapon with a very high bullet damage, you may find you're getting yourself a very large overkill which doesn't benefit you in the slightest, but taking you longer to take that final shot, which can make the difference between living and dying. That is why a very high rate of fire weapon with relatively low bullet damage will mean that these gaps where you have a relatively small amount of additional damage required to kill your target are as small as possible. Therefore, in close quarters combat, the absolute ideal weapon would only do 1 damage per bullet, but fire at 10,000 plus rounds per minute. In this way you could eliminate overkill entirely and therefore have the absolute shortest possible time to kill. Now obviously for all sorts of practical reasons you don't have these sorts of weapons in the game. However, specialist close quarter weapons tend to have a very high rate of fire, 750 going up to 850 rounds per minute. Now one counter to this point is that the guns are designed within certain ranges to kill enemies with effectively 0 overkill. 200 bullet damage weapons take 5 shots, 167 take 6, 143 take 7, etc, etc. Therefore overkill is not much of an issue. However, in practice there's all sorts of factors which may mean that this is not the case. The target may be already slightly injured, they may be just out of range and doing your maximum damage profile, they may be wearing nano-weave armor, etc, etc. Therefore using a weapon that limits potential overkill gives you an advantage. And the second factor that makes a difference is the degree of punishment you receive if you miss one of your shots. In close quarters combat, you're often spraying bullets around, moving very fast. However, the maximum potential damage for most magazines, excluding Lmgs, is enough to kill 3 or 4 infantry. Therefore, you have easily enough firepower to put down the target, but it's a question of can you land enough bullets on them before they land enough on you. Therefore, with a high rate of fire weapon, you very quickly get a nice even distribution of damage across the area your target is in. This should easily mount to enough damage to kill them. But for a low rate of fire weapon with high bullet damage, you end up with spikes of damage where the bullets are landing. Now, if all of your bullets land on target, it's not an issue. However, if you miss with a few, you don't get a nice even distribution of damage. You get spikes around areas away from your target. Therefore, comparatively, there's more downside for a low rate of fire weapon than there is with a higher rate of fire weapon. However, this profile switches around entirely when you're at long distances. Given the fact you're going to be having to burst fire your weapon to remain accurate, having a higher ideal damage per second makes less difference. This is because when burst firing, you're not going to achieve the same rate of fire as you would on full auto. Therefore, what's important is that you actually hit with your bullets. The time to kill becomes much longer, but who wins the fight is based upon who remains the most accurate. Therefore, the ideal at longer distances is having a very low rate of fire weapon with very high damage bullets. This makes bursting much easier, but it also allows you to do a lot of damage per burst. At longer ranges, having a blisteringly fast rate of fire is actually a detriment. Mechanically, it becomes harder to burst fire, your blue will quickly mount up, giving you a much wider cone of fire, and you'll quickly exhaust your number of bullets, forcing you to reload. Therefore, specialist close quarter weapons tend to suffer badly at longer ranges. So how do the different weapon types fit into these categories? Well, say we take the Carbine as an example. You can see that its hipfire accuracy is reasonable, but it gets a big boost to accuracy by ADS. Therefore, these are weapons which perform reasonably well at multiple distances. However, for an SMG, which is a specialist hipfire weapon, you can see that the hipfire is extremely good. However, relative to a Carbine, it gets much less benefit in terms of its aiming accuracy by ADS. Therefore, at medium distances, the Carbine will outperform the SMG comfortably. Now for LMGs, you can see that their hipfire is extremely poor relative to Carbines and SMGs. However, ADS accuracy is excellent. This means that the heavy assault using the LMG is heavily reliant on ADSing as opposed to relying on hipfire. However, they do have access to specialist close quarters combat LMGs, but this effectively gives them a okay hipfire as opposed to a terrible one. They still should be looking to ADS as much as possible. Now we can see from the figures from the Medic's assault rifle that they have both very good hipfire and excellent ADS accuracy. Along with the high damage profile of assault rifles, this is another reason why the Medic's assault rifle is pretty much the best weapon in the game. Therefore, as a rule of thumb, when you're thinking about choosing what weapon to use for any class, very high rate of fire, short time to kill weapons are for close quarters combat. However, as a trade-off for stability, expect their accuracy to be less than more specialist long range weapons. For longer ranges, you want a higher bullet damage, slower rate of fire weapon. And there are a variety of weapons of different flavours in between. Ultimately, the most important thing is picking a weapon you feel comfortable with. And this comes from a combination of its recoil, its accuracy, and its general feel. Now in my next episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the Infiltrator upgrades. In the meantime, have a good one, happy hunting, and Pint Pot out.